welcome to PhreakNIC.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to be going over a little bit of hardware hacking.
I'm going to be going over
And you might think,
hardware hacking.
hardware hacking.
And you might think,
pick up a
okay,
soldering iron,
hardware
start
hacking,
digging into
pick up a
something.
soldering iron, just start
But there's
digging
quite a
into
bit of process
something.
to it.
But there's quite a bit of process
that
to it.
process all starts out with
And so that process all starts out with an idea of,
got this piece of hardware.
I've got this piece of hardware. It doesn't do something I want it to do.
From there, you got to go and
reverse engineer the hardware you're going to hack and figure out how it works so that you can find some kind of an entry point to get
design everything else that goes around that.
Design everything else that goes around that.
Build it, test
Does
it.
your extra function.
Build
Build
it,
it, test
work.
it.
Repeat the whole process.
Realize
all
it
over
doesn't
again,
work. Repeat the whole process all over again, and eventually get it
So
working.
the first step is the idea.
So the first step is the idea.
You're going to come up with.
I have no clue what you guys are going to come up
But, you know,
with.
that spark of creativity.
But it's that, you know,
really
that
gets
spark
the
of
whole ball
creativity
rolling.
that really gets the whole ball.
Wow me, show me what you can do.
Wow me, show me what you can do.
So when you go about reverse engineering.
So when you go about reverse
there are a few
engineering
things that'll help you
product,
figure out what you're dealing
there are a few things that'll help you figure out what
First
you're dealing
thing is markings on
with.
any
The first
chip.
thing is
Just
markings
about
on any
anything
chip.
out there has a
Just
date
about
sheet.
anything out
It might be
there
in
has a
Chinese,
date sheet.
but
It might
you
be in
can find
Chinese, but
and usually get some
find it,
idea of what a part of
and
a
usually
circuit's
get some
doing.
idea of what a part of a circuit's
From
doing.
that, you can keep digging into what's
From that,
around
you can
it,
keep digging into
map out the
what's
traces on
around
the
it,
board, look at all
map
the
out the
little
traces on the
passive
board, look at all
components
the little passive
You
components
might
around
run
it.
into resistors.
You might
knowing
run
how to
into
read color codes
resistors.
tells you
Knowing
what
how to
values
read
you're
color
dealing
codes
with.
tells you what values you're dealing with.
Right. Surface mount ones are done with numbers.
Right. Surface mount
They
ones
really
are
don't-
done with numbers
You can't
because
really
they
read
really
color
don't.
very well.
You can't really see color
Knowing
tones
how
very
to
well.
read the polarity of
Knowing
a
how
component,
to
like
read the
capacitor or
polarity of a
diode comes in
component,
very
like
handy
a
at this
capacitor or
point.
diode comes in very handy at this
And
point.
then you work through
And
parts
then you
are,
work through,
and
you know,
you
what the
start
parts are,
looking at what signals are
and
there.
you need to start looking at
So
what
you got a few
signals
tools,
are.
you got a
You
multimeter,
got a few tools,
measure
you
your
got a
voltage coming out
multimeter,
of
you can measure
someplace,
your voltage coming out of
current,
someplace,
resistance, those kind of things.
current, resistance, those kind of things.
Even more useful is an oscilloscope.
Even more
That
useful
one's
is an
probably pretty
oscilloscope.
expensive,
That one's probably pretty expensive,
but there are lots of good options out there. You can
but
get
there are
one.
lots of good options
This
out there.
little
You can
thing
get
for
one.
about $100.
Like this little thing for about $100.
And when you start peeking into exactly what signals
And when you start
are
peeking
present
into
on the
exactly
board
what
while it's
signals
running,
are
it's very,
present on
very
the board
useful.
while it's running, it's
You
very,
figure
very
out
useful.
whether you're using some kind of crazy
You can figure out whether you're
protocol,
using some kind of crazy
what the
serial
GPIO might be
protocol,
doing.
what the GPIO might be doing.
And then the next step is to design.
And then the next step
I could
is
go
to
on for
design.
about 5 years. teaching
I could
you
go on
electrical
for about
engineering.
5 years teaching you electrical engineering, and you'd all get bored.
But eventually, you come up with a circuit.
But eventually, you
that
come up with a
you think will
circuit
do the job.
that you think
And
will
the
do
next
the job.
step is to build it all.
And the next step
There are a
is
few
to build
tools
it
you
all.
need.
There are a few tools you
Soldering
need,
irons like these ones.
some
When you're
soldering irons
building up
like
your
these
tool
ones.
set,
When you're building up your
and
tool
going for a
set,
soldering iron. What makes a soldering
and
iron
going for a
good
soldering iron.
is
What makes a soldering iron good is temperature
So,
control.
you know, if you go out to Radio Shack,
So,
spend
you know, if you go out to Radio
soldering
Shack
iron,
and spend
it's
15
a
bucks on a
constant
soldering
power.
iron,
You
it's
plug it
a
in,
constant
10 minutes
power.
later, it's
You
finally
plug it
hot
in,
enough
and
to
10
use.
minutes later, it's finally hot enough
You
to
know, you go to clean the
use.
tip on the sponge, and it's a little bit too
You
wet.
know, you got to clean the tip on the sponge, and it's a
Suck
little
all
bit
the heat
too
out of
wet,
the tip.
and you suck all the heat out of the tip,
5 minutes before you solder
and you
again.
get to wait another 5 minutes before
So
you can
something like
solder
this will
again.
run you about $100.
So something like this will run you about $100
What it
bucks.
gets you is a temperature probe. in
What
the
it
tip of
gets
the
you
iron.
is a temperature
And
probe
it'll
in the
run
tip of the
full
iron,
blast till it gets up to
and it'll
temperature,
run
and then
full
full
blast till it gets
constant
up to
temperature.
temperature,
You
and
get
then
results
full
out of it,
constant
you
temperature.
get to work a
You get
lot
better
quicker.
results out of it, you get to work a lot quicker, and life is good.
Getting into techniques of how we hack
Getting into
into
techniques
a
of
board.
how we hack
This is a
into
modded
a board.
PS2.
This is a modded
And
PS2.
Those blue wires, I don't know
And
why they're
those
always
blue wires, I
but
don't know
for
why they're
whatever
always blue,
crazy
but
reason,
for whatever
it's just always
crazy
blue.
reason, it's just always blue.
That's usually about 30
That's
gauge solid
usually
wire.
about 30 gauge
And it
solid
actually
wire.
goes back to the good
And
old
it actually
days when
goes
people used to
back
wire wrap
to
up
the good old
prototype
days when
boards.
people used to wire wrap up prototype
People don't do
boards.
that anymore because you can get
People don't do
prototype
that
circuit
anymore
boards
because you
really
can get
cheap
prototype
now.
circuit boards
But the
really
wire's
pretty
still
cheap
useful
now.
for
But the
doing
wire's
this
still
kind of work.
useful for doing
It's
this kind of
small
work.
enough that you have
It's small enough
soldering
that
iron,
if you have
hack
small
the
enough
wire
soldering
right
iron,
onto
you
the leg
can
of a
hack
really
the
tiny
wire
chip,
right onto
get
the
exactly
leg of a
where
really
you need
tiny
it.
chip, get it exactly where you need it. It's solid core, so you can bend it into any shape, and it'll generally stay in place.
Small enough that you can cram a whole bunch of wires all
small
over
enough that
the
you can
board,
cram a whole bunch of
and
wires
hopefully
all
still fit
over a
everything back
board,
in the case.
and hopefully still fit everything back in the case.
Typical techniques are to tape down wires or hot glue them in place so that things don't get torn apart
After it's all done.
So once that's all done, you're back into the same tools
you're back into the same tools you were using to reverse engineer the product in the first place.
You know how you think your circuit should function, and it's probably not going to work the first time. You're into probing things.
So you're into probing things with an oscilloscope, figuring out what the hell you did wrong.
Going back into the loop, fixing things over
and over.
Hopefully you get.
And in the end, hopefully you get
started out as an off-the-shelf
something that started out as an off-the-shelf part that really didn't do anything
combined with some
cool.
crazy idea of what you think
Combined with some crazy idea
of
of what you think
now
it
you got
should be
this
able to
hacked
do,
together
and now you got
thing
this
that
hacked
does
together
something really awesome.
thing that does something really awesome.
So, anyone have any questions?
So,
Comments?
anyone have any questions? Comments?
I have a question, actually.
Go ahead.
I have a question, actually.
Go ahead.
What types of projects have you worked on
Right.
personally?
So a good example
Right.
at work.
So a good example at work, we've got a 3D
so
printer,
it would print in PLA,
and so it would
do
print in
ABS,
PLA.
heated build
It wouldn't
plate.
do ABS. Didn't have a heated
So,
build plate.
We went through the
So,
process of adding in a
uh,
heated build plate to it.
of adding in a heated build plate to it.
You know, the process
And
is
so,
you
the
come up
process
with
is
a plate that you
come
can
up
build
with
that's gonna be
a
thermally
plate that you
conductive,
can build
replace the
that's
acrylic
going to be
one that
thermally
came on
conductive
it,
to replace the
add in
acrylic one
heating
that came on
elements, add
it,
temperature
add in
control,
heating elements, add
and then
temperature
ultimately
control,
interface it all back in
and then ultimately
to the 3D
interface it
printer
all
so
back
that you can
into the
turn
3D
the,
printer so that you can
build plate
turn
on and
the
off. And you
build
can take
plate
something
on
that
and
was
off.
designed to
And you
print
can
in
take
one
something that was
material,
designed to print in one
use
material
that
and
3D printer to
now
print
use
a
that
totally
3D
different
printer to
material.
print a totally different material.
What is your work?
I
What is your
work
work?
with CNC.
I work with CNC cutting equipment.
Any other weird projects we've done? Any other weird projects we've ever been done?
I'm also working on shipping computer for my car.
I guess another thing that really makes this all a lot easier
these days is that
what makes this all a lot easier these days too.
what makes this all a lot easier
there's
these
so
days
many
too
different,
is that there's so many different prototyping platforms out there, most notably the Arduino.
If you're gonna
where you
pack in
can-
some hardware,
If you're going
you no
to
longer
pack in
have
some
to
hardware,
design
you
up
no
a
longer
circuit
have
board from the ground
to
up.
design up a circuit board from
You
the
can
ground
slap
up.
together an Arduino.
You know, you can
run a
slap
couple
together an
wires out
Arduino,
to whatever else
run a
your
couple
interface
wires
is.
out to whatever else your
So
interface
it's
is.
become a lot easier. I think that's why it's become.
And so it's become a lot easier. I think that's why it's become a lot more prevalent these days.
What was the PS2 hack? Like, what was that addition to it with the blue wires?
Usually those are just done to.
Usually those are just done
run
to
images of games.
to
off
run
of a hard drive.
images of games off of a hard drive.
So you can just download any games you want.
So you can just
That way,
download any
instead of
games
having
you
to
want,
just-
play them that way instead of having to disc.
And is there any special, or like some things that we would be a little more prone to encounter when connecting certain things? Like what's sort of like a one-hit location or something for connecting into these things? If that like a roadmap of sort of like some basics of setting the pins.
Well, I'm not sure if you're asking about
Well,
how to know
I'm not sure if
where
you're
to
asking
connect
about
to
how to know where to
or
connect
how
to
actually make the
in a
connection.
board,
If you're looking
or
for
how
where
to
to
actually make the
connect to,
connection. If you're looking for where to
that
connect
usually
to,
comes in the form of
that
data
usually
sheet
comes in the
chips. So you'll
form
look
of
at
data
what's on the
sheet
board.
chips. So you'll look at
You'll
what's on the
usually
board.
Start with the largest chips.
You'll
work your
usually
way down
start with the
list,
largest
figure out what
chips and
everything
work your way
is.
down the list and figure out what everything is.
If it's maybe a toy
If it's
that moves
maybe
around or something, it
a
might have
toy
a
that moves
microcontroller.
around or something, it might have a
And
microcontroller
so
on
that
it.
microcontroller is basically
And so that
a tiny bit of
microcontroller is
processing
basically
power
a
and
tiny bit
IO.
of processing power and some
You'll
IO.
find
and you'll find, based on that part number, you'll find a data sheet for who made it, and it'll list out that certain pins are power, and certain pins can do general purpose I/O. You might have some that can do certain serial protocols.
So based on what you want to add to that,
So based on what you want to add
okay, I
to
don't have
that,
enough extra
you
I/O
say,
on
okay, I don't have enough extra I/O on this
cost,
chip.
they don't put anything more
I want to
than
cut
what they
costs. They
really
don't
needed
put
on there.
anything more than what they really
But they got the
needed
serial
on there.
cost that's running.
But they got the serial bus that's running.
And I
on
can
the
put
product.
some other chip that
And
rides
I
on
can
that
put
serial
some other
bus
chip that rides on
and
that
gives me
serial
extra
bus and gives me extra
And
I/O.
so you now
And
know
so
what pins to connect to make
You
that
now know
happen.
what pins to connect to make that happen.
It also gives you a good starting point. Where to
It
hook
also
up your
gives you a good
oscilloscope,
starting
look for
point,
that signal
where to
coming
hook up your
across.
oscilloscope and look
So
for
you
that
know
signal
exactly how
coming
they're using
across.
that pin.
So you know exactly how they're using that pin.
And then when it comes time to actually
And then when
solder
it comes
into
time to actually
it's mostly
solder into it,
lots of practice
it's mostly
and
just
having good enough
lots of
equipment
practice
to
and having good
be
enough
able to
equipment
get in.
to be able to
Another thing I
get
forgot
in.
to mention about
Another thing I forgot to mention about soldering irons.
what also makes them worthwhile.
What also makes them
and worth spending a
worthwhile
little bit of money on
and
is the
worth
ability to
spending a
get
little bit of
different
money
size
on
chips.
is the ability to get
So
different
these
size
two
chips.
that I've got up here.
So these
are
two
pretty
that I've got up
well-brand.
here are
I
pretty
could go
well brand.
find
I could go
knockoff of
find
this thing,
total
except that it
knockoff
doesn't take
of this thing,
pips.
except that it doesn't
So
take
where I can
pips.
go out and
So where I can go out
get any of about
and
2 dozen different
get
sizes
any
and
of
shapes
about
of
2
tips.
dozen
The good
different
one,
sizes and
I can get
shapes
4
of
for
tips.
the other
The good
model.
one, I can only get 4
And
for
it
the other
might not,
model, and
I
it
might
might
not
not
be able to get something small
I might
enough
not
to get
be able to
into
get
a
something
little tiny
small
spot
enough
on a chip.
to get into a little tiny spot on a chip.
One thing I can elaborate on.
One thing I
in this whole
can elaborate
process
on,
of reverse engineering.
in this
a
whole
lot of
process of
products are
reverse
pretty easy to
engineering,
reverse
a lot of
engineer.
products are pretty easy to reverse
Designers don't
engineer.
take any time trying
Designers
to
don't
get
take
harder
any
on you.
time trying to
But sometimes
make it
they
harder
do.
on you. But sometimes they
If
do.
you're- It's some kind of board
If
that they
you're
really want to keep
it's some kind
proprietary.
of board
There are
that they
a few
really want to
techniques
keep
that can go
proprietary,
through
there are a
to
few
make your
techniques
life
they
a
can
whole lot
go
harder.
through to make your life a whole lot
First
harder.
is to physically
First
grind the part
is
numbers
to
off the
physically
chips.
grind the part numbers
You'll
off the
see
chips.
that. Every once in a
You'll
while
see
we'll
that.
just run into that.
Every once in a while, we'll just run into that.
And it's a surprisingly effective way.
And
of
it's
keeping
a
people from
surprisingly
figuring out
effective
what's
way
going
of
on.
keeping people from
The
figuring
other
out
way
what's
of
going
doing
on.
it,
The other way of
sometimes
doing
in
it,
combination with that, is potting.
and sometimes
They'll
in
take,
combination with that, is potting, where they'll take
usually tinted black,
epoxy, it's usually
dark
tinted
opaque
black, really dark,
And they'll
opaque
pour
black.
that epoxy onto the board.
And they'll
Usually
pour
it's
that
in some
epoxy
kind
onto
of
the board.
box
Usually it's
to
in
contain
some
it all.
kind of a box
And once
to
it all
contain it
sets
all.
up, you've now got this
And once it
solid
all
chunk
sets
of
up, you've
epoxy
now got
with a
this
circuit
solid
board and all
chunk
the
of
components in it.
epoxy with a circuit
And
board and all
good
the
luck
components in
getting it
it.
off.
And good luck getting it off.
They also do that for.
They also do that
waterproofing,
for waterproofing,
protection,
for mechanical
variety of,
protection, for a variety of
that are just a lot more friendly, but
reasons that are just a lot
You
more
do see that
friendly.
a lot
But
when they just.
you do
don't
see that a
want you to
lot
get
when
into their
they
circuit.
just don't want you to get into their circuit.
That was actually going to be my question. That was actually going to be my question. Do you run into circuits that you cannot reverse engineer when you want to, or do you find a way?
There's always a way.
There's
really
always a
like
way.
photography,
It's
is
really
it worth your
like
while?
cryptography. Is it
Everything
worth
can
your
be
while?
hacked.
Everything can be hacked.
You can get a lot of microcontrollers.
You can get a
features
lot of
built into them
microcontrollers
to lock
have
out the
features
code.
built into them
So you
to
program
lock
this
out the
thing, all
code.
the code exists in
You
the
program this thing,
microcontroller,
all the code exists
but you
in the
flipped the bit when you
microcontroller,
programmed it,
but you
told
flipped the
that
bit when you
microcontroller
programmed it and told that microcontroller that nobody's ever allowed to read that memory back out through any kind of external interface.
Might also do a bit of encryption on that code as well. But
Code as
if you're
well.
determined to figure out
But
what's on there,
they determined to
you can
figure
actually
out
read
what's on
Flash
there. You can actually
by,
read Flash
removing the epoxy
by
packaging from the chip
removing the epoxy packaging
and
from the
really
chip
starting to look at
and
silicon
really
underneath.
starting to
Because when
look
you
at
write
silicon
that flash,
underneath.
there are
Because when you
physical
write
ways
that
to read
flash,
that
there
instead
are
of just
physical
normal
ways to read
electronic
that
ways.
instead of just the normal electronic ways.
Now, granted, you have to have lots and lots of
Now,
expensive
granted, you
equipment.
have to have
You're
lots and
probably
lots of
putting that
expensive
under an
equipment. You're probably
electron
putting that
microscope
under an
at that
electron
point.
microscope at that point, but it's possible.
There are other
tools out there. So there are other tools out there.
The oscilloscope I showed has
The oscilloscope I showed has
a logic probe on it.
has what's called a logic probe on it.
This one doesn't, but higher end ones do. It
This
will
one
allow
doesn't,
you
but
to
higher end
usually
ones
do
do.
8
It
or
will allow
16
you
digital
to usually
inputs all
do
at
8 or
once.
16 digital inputs all
You
at
could read out
once.
an entire parallel port.
You could read out an entire parallel port into the oscilloscope all at once. See exactly what's going on.
If they got the extra software
And
to do it, can
if they got the extra
actually
software to do it,
decode
can actually
serial or
decode the
parallel
data
string.
that's on a serial or parallel
There are
string.
other
There are other
computer that do a similar
devices you
thing.
can connect to a computer that do a
And so
similar
it's pretty
thing.
easy to hack into
And so
any
it's
kind
pretty
of data
easy to
bus
hack
moving across the
into
board.
any kind of data bus moving across the board.
And from there, figure out what's going on.
And from there, figure out what's going on.
Any other questions, comments?
Any other questions, comments?
Peter?
Beer?
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.